Hello and welcome back to the Great Patriotic War. I'm Sean Lambert and we're looking at meta madness today. And I ran across this post on the Matrix forum that is discussing what I consider to be a very interesting issue for both sides, and it's what I'm going to call the double tap strategy. Now, in this post, it's talked about how if you are in a situation where you aren't going for pockets anymore, potentially, obviously early on it's very easy to get the pockets, but maybe late in 42 or somewhere where the Soviets are stronger, or when you're the Soviet Union later in the game, you might want to have this double tap strategy in place of encirclements, because it requires less movement. That's one huge advantage of it. Less setup, less movement, but on the downside, it does require a lot more weight in one area. And so essentially what a double tap here is, and the title of this post was actually World War I style grinding, and there's a lot of people that had issues with that title in particular, but the concept is basically that you attack a unit with an overwhelming force, well, not overwhelming, but superior force, shall we say, and you hit them once and cause them to retreat, and then you hit them again and it obliterates them, either routes or surrenders. And what you see here in the statistics is that initially they're throwing up a 91, and they are sitting in a level 3 fort, which should be very strong, with 40,000 men. Should be very, very strong. But what we see here is, because of the support and the just mass of troops, it is enough to knock them back. Then, once they are knocked back, in a clear hex. So you see here they're in 238, 137, and this is in June. So it knocks them back, but it only knocks them back one hex, because now they're in 239, 137. So they're only one hex behind where they were, which is a big problem, for one thing. I don't know if they had their back to a river or something like that, why they only retreated one hex, but they only retreated one hex, which makes this strategy particularly easy. In some cases, if you don't have a good retreat path, your units won't properly retreat, or if they're out of movement. Say these units had recently attacked and they don't have any movement points. But for whatever reason, they only retreat one hex, and then this motorized corps comes along, smacks them again. This time, they're not necessarily overwhelming odds. It's 38,000 to 37,000, essentially 1-to-1, and barely superior in armored fighting vehicles and guns, with limited air support. And yet, just by tapping them again, and these are both hasty attacks, they obliterate them. Because when your units retreat, they have enough units that are damaged. This is the explanation of why it works. They have enough units that are damaged. It causes them to not get committed to the fight on an offensive side. So what it means is that you can hit it with a much weaker force than your initial force, and you still lose nothing, because they're not fighting back, essentially. Now the question came up is this just a anti-Soviet strategy? And no, it's not. It would work just as well against the Axis. You can see here, this is must be a test game of some sort, turn 6, July 27, maybe not a test game, but they get hit by a huge force. This is massively overwhelming odds, enough to retreat the infantry division. They get hit once, and then that's followed up by a tank division several tank divisions and a rifle division from the 20th Army here. And because this is a crazy amount of troops, I mean, 147,000, I don't think necessarily that this second one, the second post here, is a fair test. Because if you're hitting with overwhelming odds twice in a row on a tiny division like that, you're going to win regardless. I mean, that's just simple math. But I think this first example is perhaps more indicative of the strategy itself. And what the strategy is supposed to be simulating, I think, and this is why I think this is an intended behavior, it's not a bug or anything like that, is the idea of deep battle, deep operation, what the Soviets called it, or Schwerpunkt, which is what the Germans called it. And the differences between those strategies in real life are significant, but in a game like this, essentially they are modeled the same way. They can be modeled the same way because they both rely on attacks with infantry followed up by motorized or mechanized forces. And so I think that is what they're trying to simulate here. So let's take a look at it on the map and see if we can replicate this on turn 1. I'm sure all of you have done something like this at some point. When what you're looking for to replicate it is essentially a clear hex that's relatively well defended. So in other words, it's not just an empty hex. Like, these are essentially empty. So maybe we could do something like this. And I think what the strategy intends is to only use hasty attack. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is move 3 onto 1 hex. Let me close that out. And then select the entire core. And then hasty attack against this 1 unit here. So we see we have overwhelming odds, 51,000 to 14,000. Which doesn't quite seem fair now, does it? For the old Soviets. And they're, on top of it, they're led by Gamov, who is, I don't think he's a very good commander. Oh, I should have turned the air support off. Oops. Regardless, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. So this is perfect, except they routed. That's not the result we wanted. They hit him a little bit too hard, I guess. And on turn 1, there's so many debuffs that they're essentially not defending. So this could be a little tricky to replicate. But the idea here is you hit them really hard. This is on a swamp hex, so it's not quite right. Let's see if we can move over here. And I think this is a clear hex, maybe. Oh no, it's another swamp hex. Can I move them? Oh no, they can't move that far. Oh, wait, there's already 3 here. I'm a dummy. Let's try hitting these guys. So this is another overwhelming odds one. I just want one to just retreat. And I want him to retreat 1 hex in particular. Just so we can demonstrate the strategy in action. But the idea is, like, because we routed him on the first time, he incurred more losses than he would otherwise. And obviously, alright, this one's perfect. Obviously, if they rout, they're gonzo. So now we just have to find that guy. Let's use the motorized to find him. And I have to remember what division that was. 49th Rifle Division. So that's who we're looking for now. I think that guy, 49th Rifle Division, he's right here. So we can just move up a couple of panzers, I think, would do the job. So we'll move up these 2 panzer divisions here, and then we'll hit him again. And this time he should just explode. Again, should have turned the air support off because he's damaged. Yeah, so he just completely explodes. and now he's gone. Well, he's not gone for good, but he's down to like 60 men. And that's the strategy in action. So you can see how easy it is. You hit him with 50,000 men on a single division, and then you follow it up with a panzer attack. Now, we've only gained 1 hex, but we've completely annihilated an entire division with essentially no losses. We lost, we lost a total of 83. I guess I could just go to the commander's report. 83 plus 32. Yeah, so 100 men for an entire division. I think that's a fair trade. And that result is replicable later in the war when the Soviets can actually throw up a little bit more defense. So now, that's how you do it. How do you defend against it on the other side? Well, some suggestions were made about employing World War I style defense, defense in depth, essentially. So you have a lightly held line, and then you have a main defensive line. And this is really deep battle in reverse, which is actually how deep battle was first successfully used, in my opinion, was at the Second Battle of Kursk, where the Soviets' idea at Kursk was, this is not the big Kursk battle, this is the one before that. The Kursk at that point was a big pocket in the line. So if you imagine the Kursk bulge here, actually I could probably show it in my main campaign game. The Battle of Kursk at that point was a defensive deep operation, and the idea was to essentially employ World War I style defensive tactics. So this Kursk area here at the time was kind of a bulge. So it was defended by a couple armies, and they decided to pour in more troops. And the idea was that the Germans would attack them, and then they would counterattack with this, essentially the double tap strategy. They would be hitting the Germans with infantry divisions, and then following it up with these newly created large tank organizations, which was usually 2 tank brigades and a motorized brigade. The problem is that the Soviets found it very difficult to employ this combined operation on essentially a single turn. So if you don't have your motorized, your mobile forces in position to take advantage of any exploits of any breakthroughs you might make, then the strategy is not going to work. The key to the double tap, or the deep battle, Schwerpunkt, whatever we're going to call it, is to have your mobile forces in position close enough to the front lines, like we just saw in the previous example, so that they can follow up your breakthrough. And I think that's what's kind of missing here from the discussion, is the challenge of getting your mobile forces into position can be significant sometimes, even on the German side, because you don't know for sure where that breakthrough is going to occur. But the idea of the game strategy is that you can guarantee that you're going to break through. And that really is the difference between Schwerpunkt and deep operation. Schwerpunkt focused on a single point of attack, a focal point. I believe that's even what it means, roughly translated to focal point attack. And the advantage of that, what came to be called Blitzkrieg, was actually what people were seeing was the implementation of a German deep battle, of a breakthrough followed by an exploitation. And the exploitation is usually a combined arms operation. It needs air superiority or at least ground support. It needs mobile forces. It needs artillery. It needs the artillery to be brought up. And what you want to be doing is operating in the operational level of the enemy, disrupting their logistics. So in a case like this where I'm arrayed against this panzer group, if I were going to be doing a deep battle attack, I would want to target one of these divisions as they come up here in the open, try to knock them back a hex, and then hit them from the side with, again, overwhelming superiority. So like if this 4th Panzer Division were to come up and I somehow had enough force to knock them back, which I might be able to have, I don't know. But let's say, for example, if I could, and then I could come from the side and bring in my tank divisions if I had more than one. Ideally, you want enough of tank division to do this, and I think that's really what we're seeing here. It's not an exploit. It is intended. This is how World War II was fought, at least on the Eastern Front. So for all of you that run across posts like that complaining of huge losses after getting double tapped, just remember that this was the intended strategy of both sides. They had different ways of going about it. Deep operation on the Soviet side was generally considered to be a broad front strategy. It was at the front level. That's how it was supposed to be coordinated, because motorized and mechanized forces were not usually under the same command as the infantry. They were usually in separate commands, and the Air Force obviously didn't have any ability to coordinate because they didn't even have radios half the time. So their deep operations were scheduled on timetables initially, which caused a lot of problems. And on the German side, they were much more flexible, but they were also much more focused on the idea of hitting a single point with their attacks, which is obviously what you see early in Barbarossa. Just looking at that one battle we just showed, where you have a bunch of units all trying to converge on one focal point, and then following it up with a panzer attack. It's hugely effective, but it is costly in terms of time. And so that is the downside to it. You can make these huge attacks, and they are very powerful and very successful, but they do cost a little bit of time. And if I were recommending a strategy to defend against it, I would say, yes, you could try the lightly held frontline strat, but I think what's going to happen is they're just going to push through it and get to the next line too quickly, because sometimes if you only have one division there, they can just hit it once and it will rout. But if you have, and that might leave them enough MPs, movement points, to be able to get to your next line. So you have to have a good amount of separation between your front line and your main line if you're going to try it that way. So like in this case, obviously if this infantry units here were able to break through at any point here, there's a pretty good distance between this area near Bryansk and the Oka River. So they're not going to be able to do that in one turn. They can't hit my units and get all the way up here. But what they could do, though, is they could hit my units and then completely destroy them if they follow it up with a panzer division. And that's your fear as a Soviet player. But to counter it, and this was brought up in the discussion on the forum, the best way to counter it is a counterattack. Because if you can position your forces such that when you get hit, you're into the next level of your defenses, but you have a force on the flank that you can attack with, and this was kind of the concept at Uranus. You are able to build up forces on the flank and just hold out long enough, but while the Germans are trying to hit you and just destroy you. So it is this race to see who can get in position first, and I think that's the beauty of this game, is it allows for that positional play to kind of happen naturally with the rule set. Well, that's pretty much the strategy. Again, somewhat difficult to set up, but very powerful. Arguably impossible to defend against early in the game, but as you go later and later in the game, you can think about counterattacking it. So the key is to preserve as much of your force as you can as the Soviets or as the Germans later in the war. Don't let your forces get obliterated if you can avoid it. But lightly held is difficult to do because even losing a full division, it's a lot of men. And that takes another division from somewhere else to replace it. So I can see the point of it being a very difficult strategy to defeat, but it is intended. That was the strategy, and to see it successfully pulled off is not necessarily a foolproof thing. Like you do have to prepare a little bit, and if you give the Germans time to prepare, of course they're going to be able to destroy you. It just makes sense. So with that, I'll see you in the next one.